By the end of this video, we are going to do a live review for the Heaven Hill 18, but I decided to combine it with a question that I got from the community in regards to our scoring system. Particularly, what is the scoring system, how does it work, and why do we do it? So we're going to tackle both of those things in today's Tuesday discussion, and interested to hear if you have tried this Heaven Hill 18. Come back in the comments and let us know what you think as well. So thank you for joining me today, Whiskey friends. Let's kick off the show. Hello again, whiskey friends. Thanks for joining, everybody. So today we are going to put the Tuesday discussion around both the scoring system and doing a review live using a sample that Darrell gave me of the Heaven Hill 18 year, which I have just poured into the glass to give this thing a bit of time to open up while we're yapping about other things. So keep in mind, with Tuesdays, always creating video content related to the questions and comments we get from either YouTube, Instagram, or our wonderful Patreon community. So if you have a different topic that you'd like us to handle, hey, let us know in the comments. Get to those as soon as we can. So pulling up my little spiel here. First, how does the scoring system work? So if you've watched our reviews, we do have a scoring system behind every review. To date, we have reviewed over 350 whiskeys between Kelsey, Darrell, and I over the last year and a half, and that gives me a whole lot of data to play with. Now, the idea behind the scoring system was to give a rating to each step of the experience, from the nose, the front of the palate, mid palate, the finish. Each of those essentially has a different component, whether it be flavor or experience. So as an example, when it comes to mid palate, did you like the flavors? That's the flavor score. But was there complexity there in the flavors? Was there depth to those flavors? That would be the experience. So why do we rate every whiskey in the way that we do? Well, for us, it does help us then do comparisons when it comes to different whiskeys that we like and doing our top 10 lists and doing our top 5 lists of a certain category. When we sat there and done all the homework and meticulously rated all of these, it helps us out quite a bit. The other thing that the rating system does is that because we're rating each component of the whiskey and then coming up with an overall score, it keeps us from just giving higher scores to things that we like for one particular reason. Something, I really like the mid palate on that, I'm going to call it a 90. More of a gut instinct. That's not what we do. We rate every component of the whiskey, and then the final score is what it is. So there isn't a way to kind of bias the rating in that way. It just has to add up. This also helps Kelsey, Darrell, and I explain differences in our own palates and see how we rate different whiskeys or the same whiskeys different ways, what things we call out if we're calling out the same things. It's interesting sometimes how often our scores are within maybe a ±2 of each other. We tend to have very similar palates, but every now and then there is a whiskey that does surprise us and we might be like 10 points off in difference, and that gives us something then to discuss. So when it comes to a baseline, then, all of these metrics that we use are on a 0 to 10 scale. And essentially, we look at 7 as a baseline whiskey. So if something is just essentially average or what's to be expected, it's going to be a 7. Whereas if it does start getting into things that are off-putting, really dropping the ball somewhere, we're getting into 6s and 5s. But then as it starts to shine, and to the degree it starts to shine, it starts getting 8, 9s, 10s. So when it comes to the overall flavor score, then, things that we have rated that were essentially a 70% on the flavor score, so it essentially got 7s across the boards. Here are some examples of some whiskeys. Wild Turkey 101, Old Forester Statesman, Benchmark Foolproof. So if we're talking about a whiskey that is just a 7 through and through, those are a few examples. So then moving on to experience. When it comes to that baseline of a 7 of experience, some examples again would be the Wild Turkey 101. So a lot of the times when you think about it, I mean, a baseline whiskey is the Wild Turkey 101. That makes a whole lot of sense. Another one I wrote down for experience is the Old Forester 1920. When it comes to the mouth feel and the finish and the complexity of the flavors, that's kind of baseline. Whereas the flavors that it does give, I like a lot, and that then elevates that score. Then another one that I gave a 70 on experience was the Jack Daniel's Triple Mash. A lot of the times when it comes to the experience too, I think the experience is influenced a bit by the proof, especially depending on what the original proof of that whiskey was before they watered it down, whether it was able to retain its oiliness for the mouthfeel, which tends to then follow through to a longer finish. Something that's watered down to 90 probably doesn't have a incredible mouthfeel to it, probably doesn't have a incredibly long finish either. So it is going to then be held back on the experience side. But not all high proof whiskeys ultimately have those things. And that's also why I threw that Old Forester 1920 in there. For being 115 proof, they did have to water it down quite a bit to get there. And it shows up in different parts of the experience, though I absolutely do love the flavors that I get from 1920. So it's one of my favorite whiskeys, but I wanted to point it out here on where it is just baseline. So then moving on here, what is a great score for a whiskey then? I mean, ideally, I don't like to drink things that essentially are under an 80 when it comes to the score. Anything under an 80, it's kind of like, I'm wasting my time. There's only so many drinks that I can have any given week, any given time. So it's just, I know there's better alternatives out there. So I do seek out things that are going to score above an 80. And ideally, if I can get things above an 85, that's when we start getting into things that are really going to make me smile. And if you think about a score of an 85, then just down the line, that means half the metrics scored a 9 and half the metrics scored an 8. It's really hard to score an 85 or higher getting any 7s or 6s or anything, because then you'd have to get 10s to balance that out. And then if it comes to something that's scoring 90 plus points, now we're getting into unicorn status. And there aren't too many of those. So what we're going to do here today is something new. I haven't tried this before. Durrell gave me a sample of Heaven Hill 18 that has been airing out in this glass as I've been talking about the scoring system itself. I'm going to do some editing on this video. That way you don't have to really see me go through the process. But I'm going to go through the nose, the front palate, mid palate, finish, overall. I'm going to rate all these in my notes that I have in front of me. And then by the end of this, we'll see where I then rate the Heaven Hill 18 year. Now, I'm trying to go into this with as open mind as I can, but I do know what Durrell thinks of this, and I do know what Kelsey thinks of this. I have avoided looking at how they scored it. I actually don't think Kelsey scored it, but I know Durrell did. And I'm trying to go into this with an open mind, but they were not impressed by this pour. So it's going to be on me, if I am not impressed, to articulate why and where I'm not impressed using the scoring system. So cheers, everybody. Let's get into the nose, and then I'll figure out how to edit this thing so that it's not a half hour long as we go into this. Cheers, everybody. All right, we're back. Let's go over the nose here. So on the nose, I actually like this nose quite a bit. I gave it an 8 on flavor and 8 on depth. And what I like about this nose, first starting out with the flavor, the oak. I mean, it's 18 years old, so of course the oak is there, but there is this very lovely initial oak on this pour. Strangely, though, it does dissipate a little bit, turns more into the vanilla and caramel, kind of some of your generic bourbon flavors. So the oak is there at first, but it's not omnipresent. What then really intrigues me and made me up the depth score, there is essentially dried flowers on this thing, like a potpourri. I don't recall getting that off of a Heaven Hill product very often. And then, I mean, I guess it's along the same lines. If we went to dried teas, I was trying to figure out which one to go with in my notes, the dried potpourri or the dry tea. I guess it's kind of the same thing if you're just smelling it, but it would be a brighter tea, a tea with some fruits in it, that type of thing. Oh, and there's also a little bit of a nuttiness here. Now, it doesn't come across as aggressive as a nuttiness as a lot of the Heaven Hills that I've had, like the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, which is probably going to come up over and over again in this review. The Brazil nut, something more subtle when it comes to the nuttiness on this one. All right. I think that's it for the nose. Let's now go to the palate. This one's going to take me a little while as I break down each and every component of this. So once again, I'll find some editing to jump back into the scoring part of it. Cheers, everybody. I think I'm good here. Let's go through the scores on this one. Oh, still getting the finish in, so now I got to talk through that. But the finish it's got some good length to it. We'll get to that. So starting out, when I'm talking about what I'm experiencing at front, it's really about those initial flavors upon uh, you know, the whiskey entering my mouth. There are a lot of whiskeys that, yeah, I mean, you can sit there and you can just let it sit and there's like no flavor at all. It's almost like brown sugar water, um, like sucking on a rock candy. Like there's not a whole lot of depth or interesting things going on until you swallow and get to the mid palate and get into the finish. It just does nothing. It could be a big nothing burger. This one actually is really strong up front. The flavors that I'm getting initially, I like it quite a bit. I gave an 8 here on the flavors up front. It's all of this rich vanilla almond paste, and there's this effervescence to it that is very interesting. Again, for a Heaven Hill product, maybe that goes back to the nose having those interesting qualities too of the dried floral. I don't know. It shows up almost immediately, and the mouthfeel is rich and creamy. I gave the mouthfeel a 9. So then things kind of fall apart for me a little bit here. Mid palate, it's flat. It is strangely flat for what it is. Uh, Geez, the oak is there, and that's probably the best part of it. Uh, Flavors would be orange, a bit of vanilla, and some caramel, almost like a caramel bark. It's kind of strange on that one. I gave it a 7 on flavors and a 7 on complexity, which is probably the weirdest part of the scoring so far, is just how much I don't appreciate the mid palate. So let's get into the finish. Finish again, it's all about the oak. The oak is a bit drying. Uh, Gosh, there's even a weird brightness mid palate that's driving me nuts. But the oak is a little drying, and I think that brought me down a little bit. There's just lots of oak and this lingering vanilla. A little bit of that orange still remains. But the finish does last for quite a while. I am still experiencing it. There's this nice pepper and nice spice on the back of the finish too. Um, so the length of the finish I gave an 8, but the flavors I gave a 7. So it's like I appreciate that it's there and what it's doing in terms of the experience, and because it was so rich and oily. But yeah, I'm not digging the flavors. So then the last two metrics that we can talk about then are going to be overall with the balance of this whiskey and then the value. The balance, I did end up giving this one an 8. The flavor scores almost made me want to bring it down to a 7, but it is rich, it's oily, it's packing a lot of flavor up front. That 18-year oak is quite nice. Um, Now, maybe I'm just not the intended audience for this one. I could see people sitting around a table, chatting, smoking cigars, and like sipping on this and being like, oh, this one's so smooth and delicious. And it's got these great vanillas and it's got this great oak and leather. It's just kind of a nothing burger for me, though, which is very strange to say on a pour this expensive. So the MSRP on this is $300. The secondary price is probably going to be 5 times that, kind of a ridiculous amount. Uh, I struggle with this one, even paying anything over 120 for it. I would much rather have a Hardin's Creek as an example of a very similar pour. Much rather have a Hardin's Creek for 160 than this. So that's where I really had to bat this thing down when it came to the value. If I'm kind of at a point where it's like, maybe it'd be worth it to me if it was half as much as what the MSRP is now. Oof. I mean, that takes you into Calumet 16 territory, and that kind of makes sense too. I gave it a 5 on value, which is really going to take down the overall score. I got to do math. Let me do some math. We'll be right back here, and I'll figure out the flavor score, the experience score, the value score, and where it netted overall. All right. Got the math done. Always great doing math while sipping on whiskey, as if that's a thing people should be doing. But where we end up then with the overall flavor score was a 75 out of 100. Now, what that means is it scored 75% of the possible points when it came to flavor. And if you remember back, I gave 2 of the flavor metrics an 8 and 2 of the flavor metrics a 7. Thus, how it ends up at a 75 right down the middle. Experience gave it an 80. Once again, that's probably where it does stand out. The richness of the mouthfeel, the length of the finish, the depth of the nose. It's got some interesting flavors going on there. So it is interesting from an experience standpoint, even though the flavors don't quite bring what I want out of it. And then the value score. 50 out of 100. I gave it a 5 out of 10. That's just half of the possible points on value. That takes the overall score down quite a bit when it doesn't live up to the value. The final score on this pour ends up at a 75 out of 100, which is pretty low ranking on our scoring system. Even if you took away how much I batted it down for the value score, a pour like this scoring 78 to 80s, if we took away the value metric entirely, is still underperforming for a $300 whiskey. So I understand then kind of the trepidation that Darrell and Kelsey have expressed so far with this pour. I'm interested to talking to them a bit more about it now that I've gone through this experience. So thank you for joining me today, whiskey friends. Hopefully this is a lot shorter than the recording time than what it's showing me right now. I'll try to edit this down, probably get it to half the length. But hopefully that illuminates a little bit more on what we're doing here on the channel. And yes, if you have any other topics or questions you'd like us to handle on a future Tuesday, let us know. We'll catch you next time. Goodbye, whiskey friends.